Art has the power to unite people, nations, and cultures. Historians point to centuries of instances where a culture's art has influenced masterpieces from entirely different societies. An intriguing example of this artistic exchange can be found in the paintings of the 17th century Indian Mughal dynasty. During that era, artwork created in Eastern cultures began showcasing elements of images of the European Renaissance. Here with me today to discuss the synthesis of Eastern and Western artistic languages is Mika Natif, Assistant Professor of Art History and a scholar of Islamic art and architecture. Her first book, Eros and Sexuality in Islamic Art, was published in 2013. Thank you for joining us today, Mika.
Thank you.
How did artistic styles from Renaissance Europe find their way into 17th century Islamic art? Was this a case of art refusing to be constrained by religious boundaries?
In late 16th and early 17th century, there were lots of merchants from Italy, from Portugal, Spaniard merchants, and later on the English, who came to India to create these kind of commercial connections with the subcontinent. Also, the Jesuits came a bit later, and they had three missions trying to convert the Mughal Muslim emperors and upper class, the elite. And they brought with them all kinds of material culture stuff, like printed books, oil paintings, textiles, all kinds of luxury goods. And through these kind of exchanges and interactions, diplomatic, all kinds of conversations at the court, intellectual exchanges, you start to see the impact of these works of art creeping into the Mughal tradition. In terms of art refusing to stay in its own boundaries, that's a very interesting question, because what the Mughal artists are doing and the patrons, they are not trying to recreate Renaissance art in India. They are using these idioms and transforming them into a Mughal language and looking at themselves. They're not interested in Europe, they're interested in how to reflect themselves, and here they got these incredible tools and materials that they can create another layer of meaning to their tradition.
So it's fascinating how trade was so pivotal to the convergence of these two cultures. So what was the significance of this shared artistic imagery between East and West during the Renaissance? Did it impact politics, religion, or philosophy?
That's a wonderful idea to think about, because what we see from these images is how the Mughal emperors, the Muslim emperors, are positioning themselves vis-a-vis Europe, more specifically Christian Europe. And they are also, by their names, the titles that they give to themselves, they are talking about themselves as universal rulers and the head of universal religions and leaders. So it's not so much the idea of welcoming the West or opening their arms and embracing Renaissance traditions. It's more about how they are looking and reflecting about themselves and their own image. So in many ways, yes, politics has a lot to do with it, and it's very important to think about how the Mughals are playing a role in that world or global tradition that we're looking at in that exchange.
So these rulers truly saw themselves as universal leaders. Can you walk us through some examples of the use of European imagery and techniques by Muslim artists?
Let's look at a few examples. In the first image that we're looking at, we see Jahangir, the Mughal emperor, positioned above an image of Jesus. And look at what Jahangir is holding in his hand. He's holding an orb or the globe in his hand, and he's gazing kind of far away, further into the future. While if we look at the image of Jesus, we see a very vulnerable, very sensitive image looking down and also below the emperor, which is very telling. So this is not the idea of creating Christian images or Renaissance images. It's how the Mughal Empire and the Mughal ruler is seeing himself and positioning himself in this kind of hierarchy. And also Islam as the last monotheistic tradition and the third, the seal of prophecy, is actually playing a part here where the Muslim ruler is above the Christian Son of God. The next example is fascinating in terms of the colors, the subject matter, the usage of perspective. Look at the background in which we have this very deep recession into a veranda, the beautiful curtain that is hanging at the background, And also the figure, the female figure with a bare breast and the child that is lying in the center of the composition. So it has been titled by contemporary scholars as the Madonna and Child, but there is nothing here that connects it to the tradition of the Madonna other than the association of a mother and child. And if we read the Persian poetry above and below the image, it is talking about the beautiful silver moon face of the female figure and her breasts. So there is an idea of eroticization and exoticization of the other, if you want, in this respect. And if we look at the technique, the folds, what she's wearing, the kind of volumetric description of the image, the receding background, these are all elements that are connected to Renaissance European tradition that are introduced or being used by the Mughal artists to create a very indigenous tradition in Mughal art.
Is that a Bible?
It is unclear what book it is. It is an open book, and you have the idea of book. There is also a goblet with wine, there is a wine bottle, and there is a fruit. There is some kind of an animal, either a cat or a dog. It's unclear. So there is these kind of elements of pleasure and the idea of pleasure. Also, they're lying on this beautiful golden carpet that is shimmering and creating a very interesting effect to the entire composition of kind of luxury and wealth and really pastime pleasure.
So Mika, what is the significance of what you just described to us for the 17th century?
Oftentimes scholars, contemporary scholars, are thinking about how the Mughals were interested or incorporating these ideas from Renaissance and from Europe into India and Mughal ideas. And what we see actually in the painting is that they're not interested in the others. They're interested about themselves, and that's another layer and another aspect about learning about themselves. And even you see it in the titles that the rulers are taking for themselves, the names. For example, Akbar is the greatest. Jahangir is the world conqueror. And they're positioning themselves as world leaders and the heads of world religions. So it's something about their global aspirations, but within their boundaries. They are not so much interested in what we think about today as global perspective. Their global ideas are slightly different. And that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're using these very loaded terms.
So when we translate what happened in the past into our modern era, what is it, the lessons that we are to draw from these paintings in our modern times?
I think it's really interesting to think about how cultures move or change from one place to another. And even in today, when the West is such a strong and powerful entity and everybody wants to wear jeans and drink Coca-Cola, we still have to think, what does it mean in other places to adopt these kind of values and these kind of ideas? It doesn't necessarily mean that the fact that they look similar or somewhat similar, that they have the same kind of ideas. In terms of the art market, there is a thriving art market of Indian artists that are working between contemporary and combining these kind of modes between contemporary and traditional, still Mughal ideas in terms of paintings. And there is a great market for it in the West, but also a huge market that is growing very fast, really the hot thing in India itself. And that's fascinating.
And so you think some of that retranslation of East and West is something that even happens today?
Absolutely, yeah.
This has been an incredibly timely topic, and we very much appreciate your sharing this artistic, cross-cultural perspective. And so thank you so much, Mika, for coming and sharing your research with us today.
Thank you.